The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, its golden waves rippling under the merciless afternoon sun. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her scope and settled deeper into her concealed position among the rocky outcrop. 3 days they had been here, waiting for the target to appear. 3 days of scorching heat, limited water, and the constant buzz of insects that seemed determined to make their mission miserable. "Contact in Sector 7, whispered Lieutenant Jake Morrison through her earpiece. His voice carried the tension they all felt. 2 vehicles approaching from the northeast. Maria shifted her rifle slightly, the Barrett M82 heavy and familiar in her hands. Through her scope, she could see dust clouds growing larger on the horizon. After months of tracking Hassan Malik, the arms dealer responsible for supplying insurgent groups across the region, they finally had him in their sights. "Rodriguez, what's your 20? Morrison's voice crackled again. "South perimeter, all clear," came the immediate response from Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez. "Thompson?" "North side locked down, LT," replied Corporal Mike Thompson. Maria remained silent, focused on her task. As the team's designated marksman, her job was simple: eliminate the target when the moment came. She had done it dozens of times before across 3 combat deployments. Her steady hands and sharp eyes had saved countless American lives and disrupted numerous terrorist operations. The vehicles grew closer, black SUVs kicking up massive dust trails as they approached the compound below. Intelligence had been tracking Malik for 6 months, and this remote location in the Syrian desert was supposed to be his final destination before disappearing into the underground again. "Santos, you have eyes on target?" Morrison asked. "Negative, not yet," Maria replied, her voice calm and professional despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Vehicle windows are tinted." Waiting for visual confirmation. The first SUV stopped outside the compound's main gate. Maria watched through her scope as several armed men emerged, their movements careful and coordinated. These were not amateur fighters. They moved like professionals, scanning the area for threats before allowing anyone else to exit the vehicle. "Multiple armed hostiles," Maria reported. "Count 6, all carrying assault rifles. They're setting up a defensive perimeter." "Copy that," Morrison acknowledged. "Hold position until we have confirmed target identification." Maria had been with SEAL Team 7 for 2 years now, one of only a handful of women to successfully complete the grueling training pipeline. She had fought twice as hard as her male counterparts to prove herself worthy of wearing the trident, and she had never let her team down. Her record was spotless, her skills undeniable, and her loyalty to her brothers absolute. The second vehicle approached more slowly. Maria held her breath as figures began emerging from the passenger compartment. 2 men in expensive suits, another in military fatigues, and, finally, stepping into the harsh sunlight, Hassan Malik himself. "Target confirmed," Maria whispered into her microphone. "Hassan Malik, center of the compound courtyard, approximately 400 meters southwest of my position." "Outstanding, Santos. Wait for my command." Through her scope, Maria studied the target. Malik was shorter than she had expected from his photographs, probably in his early 50s with graying hair and a well-trimmed beard. He moved confidently, gesturing to his security detail as they escorted him toward the compound's main building. "Wind speed 2 knots from the east," Maria reported, automatically calculating the adjustments needed for a clean shot. "Clear line of sight. Ready to engage on your command." "Stand by," Morrison replied. Maria controlled her breathing, a technique drilled into every sniper until it became second nature. In, hold, out. Her heart rate slowed, her hands steadied, and the world around her seemed to fade away until only the target existed in her universe. Suddenly, her earpiece erupted with static and panicked voices. "We've got company," Rodriguez shouted. "Multiple vehicles incoming from the south." "How many?" Morrison demanded. "At least 6 trucks, heavily armed. They're moving fast." Maria kept her scope trained on Malik even as chaos erupted around her. Through her peripheral vision, she could see dust clouds approaching from multiple directions. The intelligence had been wrong. This was not just a meeting, it was a trap. "Santos, take the shot now," Morrison commanded. "We need to extract immediately." Maria squeezed the trigger. The Barrett roared, its massive .50 caliber round crossing the distance in less than a second. Through her scope, she watched Hassan Malik's chest explode in a spray of blood as he crumpled to the ground. "Target down," she reported calmly, already working the bolt to chamber another round. "All units, fall back to extraction point Alpha," Morrison shouted over the increasing gunfire. "Move, move, move." Maria began breaking down her position, quickly packing her rifle and equipment. As the team sniper, she always carried the heaviest gear, but years of training had taught her to move efficiently even under pressure. She could hear automatic weapons fire growing closer as hostile forces converged on their location. "Santos, what's your status?" Morrison called. 30 seconds out, Maria replied, slinging her rifle across her back and grabbing her heavy pack. "Rodriguez and Thompson are already at the LZ. Hustle up, we've got birds incoming in 2 mics." Maria scrambled down the rocky slope, her boots finding purchase on the loose gravel as bullets began snapping past her position. The hostile forces had spotted her muzzle flash and were directing fire toward her former hiding spot. She could hear the distinct whine of ricochets as rounds struck the rocks around her. The extraction point was a flat area roughly 1 kilometer from her sniper position, far enough away to avoid immediate detection but close enough for a quick escape. Maria ran as fast as her heavy equipment would allow, every step taking her closer to safety and her waiting teammates. She could see the extraction point ahead now, a cleared area where Rodriguez and Thompson were already setting up a defensive perimeter. Morrison was visible near a cluster of boulders, speaking rapidly into his radio while scanning the horizon for their ride home. "LZ in sight," Maria reported, breathing heavily as she covered the final 100 meters. That's when she heard it, the distinctive thump of helicopter rotors approaching fast and low. The extraction bird was coming in hot, just as planned. Maria felt a surge of relief as she ran the last 50 meters toward her teammates. Rodriguez waved her toward their position while Thompson maintained security, his rifle trained on the advancing enemy forces. Maria could see muzzle flashes in the distance as the hostile fighters pursued them across the desert floor. "There she is," Morrison shouted over the growing noise of the approaching helicopter. "Come on, Santos." Maria sprinted toward the landing zone as the helicopter flared for landing, its rotor wash creating a massive dust cloud that provided concealment from enemy observation. She could barely see through the swirling sand, but she could make out the dark outline of the aircraft and the figures of her teammates moving toward it. She was 30 meters away when the world exploded around her. The incoming rocket-propelled grenade struck the ground between Maria and the helicopter, the blast wave throwing her violently to the ground. Her ears rang, her vision blurred, and she tasted blood in her mouth as she struggled to understand what had happened. Through the dust and smoke, she could see the helicopter still on the ground, its engine screaming as the pilot prepared for immediate takeoff. Morrison was visible near the aircraft's open door, shouting something she couldn't hear over the ringing in her ears. Maria struggled to her feet, fighting against the disorientation caused by the blast. Her rifle was still strapped to her back, her pack intact, but her left leg felt weak and unsteady. She took a step toward the helicopter and nearly collapsed as pain shot through her knee. The aircraft was lifting off now, rising slowly into the air as more enemy fire converged on their position. Maria limped forward, waving her arms to attract attention, but the helicopter continued climbing. "Wait," she screamed, though she knew her voice couldn't carry over the engine noise. "I'm here." Through the swirling dust, she could see figures in the helicopter's doorway. Morrison was there, along with Rodriguez and Thompson. They were looking in her direction, but the dust cloud was too thick. They couldn't see her through the debris kicked up by the explosion. The helicopter banked sharply to the left, gaining altitude rapidly as it moved away from the advancing enemy forces. Maria watched in growing horror as her ride home disappeared into the afternoon sky, leaving her alone in the middle of hostile territory. She stood there for a long moment, unable to process what had just happened. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, and she knew she had only minutes before enemy fighters reached her position. The blast had thrown her equipment everywhere, and she needed to gather what she could before moving. Her survival training kicked in automatically. First priority, establish security and assess the situation. Second priority, gather essential equipment. Third priority, move to a defensive position and establish communication. Maria quickly inventoried her gear. Her rifle was undamaged, though covered in dust and debris. Her pack contained 3 days' worth of water, emergency rations, a medical kit, and her satellite communication radio. Her sidearm was still holstered and secure. The approaching vehicles were less than a kilometer away now, their engines clearly audible over the desert silence. Maria grabbed her essential gear and began moving toward a rocky area that would provide both concealment and defensive positions. As she limped across the open ground, fighting against the pain in her injured knee, one thought dominated her mind: her teammates had left her behind. Whether intentionally or by accident, the result was the same. She was alone in enemy territory with limited supplies and no immediate prospect of rescue. The rocky outcropping offered good concealment and multiple escape routes if the position became compromised. Maria settled into a defensive position and activated her satellite radio, hoping to establish contact with her command post. Neptune Base, this is Triton 7, she whispered into the handset. I need immediate extraction, over. Static filled her earpiece. She adjusted the antenna and tried again. Neptune Base, urgent extraction request from Triton 7 actual, how copy? More static. The satellite radio was working, but she was not receiving any response. Either the command post was not monitoring this frequency, or something was interfering with the transmission. Through her binoculars, Maria could see the enemy vehicles had reached the extraction site. Armed fighters were dismounting and beginning a systematic search of the area. It would not take them long to find her tracks leading toward the rocks. She had perhaps 30 minutes before they discovered her position. 30 minutes to figure out how to survive alone in hostile territory with no support, no backup, and no realistic chance of rescue. Maria checked her rifle one more time, ensuring it was ready for action. She had been trained for situations like this, though she had never expected to face them alone. Every SEAL learned survival, evasion, resistance, and escape techniques, but those skills were always practiced with the assumption that help would eventually arrive. Now, as enemy fighters began spreading out to search for her, Maria Santos realized that help might not be coming at all. She was on her own in the middle of a desert controlled by people who would kill her without hesitation if they found her. The thought of her teammates safely aboard their helicopter, heading back to base while she fought for her life, filled her with a mixture of anger and determination. They had left her behind, but she was still alive, still armed, and still dangerous. Maria Santos was a Navy SEAL, and Navy SEALs never quit. No matter what it took, no matter how long it took, she would find a way to survive and make it home. And, when she did, she would have some very serious questions for the men who had abandoned her in the desert. The enemy search teams were getting closer now, their voices carrying across the rocky terrain as they called out to each other in Arabic. Maria settled deeper into her concealed position, her finger resting lightly on her rifle's trigger guard. The real fight was just beginning. Maria pressed herself deeper into the narrow crevice between two large boulders as the voices grew closer. Her injured knee throbbed with each heartbeat, but she forced herself to remain perfectly still. Through a gap in the rocks, she could see 3 armed men methodically searching the area where the helicopter had landed. The men moved with practiced efficiency, their weapons ready as they examined every potential hiding spot. These were not untrained militia fighters. Their movements, equipment, and coordination suggested professional military background, possibly former Syrian Army Special Forces. One of the searchers stopped less than 10 meters from Maria's position and spoke into his radio in rapid Arabic. She understood enough of the language to catch the key words: American, sniper, and tracks. They knew she was here somewhere, and they were determined to find her. Maria slowly reached for her sidearm, a Sig Sauer P226 loaded with 15 rounds of 9mm ammunition. Her rifle would be more effective, but the noise would immediately reveal her position to every hostile fighter in the area. If she had to fight, it would need to be quick and silent. The searcher moved closer, his eyes scanning the rocky terrain with the intensity of a man who knew his prey was nearby. Maria could see his face clearly now, weathered features, graying beard, and the hard eyes of someone who had seen too much combat. He carried a Russian-made AK-74 assault rifle and wore a tactical vest loaded with extra magazines. He stopped directly in front of her hiding spot and began examining the ground for footprints. Maria held her breath, knowing that any sound or movement would give away her position. Her hand tightened on the pistol grip as the man stepped closer to the gap where she lay concealed. A shout from across the search area diverted his attention. One of the other fighters had found something, probably equipment scattered by the rocket blast. The searcher near Maria's position moved quickly toward his teammate, leaving her temporarily alone. Maria knew this was her chance. The search teams would soon discover the trail leading to her current position, and then, her concealment would be worthless. She needed to move now, while they were distracted, and find a more secure location. She carefully gathered her essential gear: rifle, ammunition, water, medical kit, and radio. Everything else would have to be left behind. Speed and stealth were more important than equipment right now. Moving as quietly as possible, Maria began working her way deeper into the rocky terrain. Her injured knee made every step painful, but she gritted her teeth and pushed forward. The rocks provided excellent concealment, but they also created natural choke points where a single enemy fighter could trap her. Behind her, she could hear increased activity as more vehicles arrived at the search site. The enemy was reinforcing their efforts, bringing in additional manpower to find her. Maria estimated at least 20 fighters were now involved in the hunt, and more were arriving every few minutes. She reached a small plateau that offered good visibility in all directions. Through her binoculars, Maria could see the full scope of the enemy operation. 6 vehicles were parked at the original landing zone, with fighters spreading out in ever-widening circles as they searched for her trail. More concerning was the arrival of 2 military trucks carrying what appeared to be tracking equipment. Professional soldiers with radio direction finding gear and, possibly, thermal imaging devices. The casual search was becoming a serious manhunt, and Maria's chances of remaining hidden were decreasing rapidly. She activated her satellite radio and tried again to establish contact with her command post. Neptune Base, this is Trident 7 in urgent need of extraction. I am evading enemy forces and require immediate assistance, over. Still nothing but static. Maria checked the radio's battery level and antenna connections. Everything appeared functional, but no one was responding to her calls. Either the radio was malfunctioning, or her command post was not monitoring the emergency frequency. A more troubling possibility occurred to her: maybe they thought she was dead. If Morrison and his team had reported her killed in the blast, there would be no one listening for her transmissions. She would be on her own until she could somehow prove she was still alive. Maria switched frequencies and tried again, broadcasting on the emergency channel monitored by all coalition forces in the region. Any station, this is Trident 7 requesting immediate assistance. American operator evading enemy forces in Grid Square 77 Delta, Quebec. Please acknowledge, over. The response came immediately, but not from a friendly voice. American sniper, a heavily accented voice said in broken English. We know you are listening. We know you are here. Surrender now and we will not hurt you. Continue hiding and we will find you anyway. Maria felt her blood run cold. The enemy had been monitoring her radio transmissions. They now knew she was alive and had equipment capable of intercepting her communications. Every time she used the radio, she was potentially giving away her position. She switched off the radio and removed the battery. From now on, communications would be too dangerous to attempt. She was truly on her own. The sound of helicopter rotors filled the air, and Maria looked up to see an enemy aircraft approaching from the east. It was an older Soviet-era helicopter, probably a Mi-8, equipped with external speakers and what appeared to be thermal imaging equipment. The aircraft began a systematic search pattern, flying slowly over the rocky terrain while broadcasting messages in Arabic and English. Maria could not understand the Arabic portions, but the English was clear: surrender or face the consequences. She pressed herself against the underside of a large boulder as the helicopter passed overhead. Thermal imaging would be less effective during the day due to the heat radiating from the sun-baked rocks, but she could not take any chances. The helicopter moved on, continuing its search pattern over the surrounding area. Maria used the noise to mask her movement as she relocated to a new position further up the slope. The higher elevation would provide better visibility but also make her more exposed to aerial observation. As she climbed, Maria's mind raced through possible escape scenarios. The nearest friendly forces were at least 50 kilometers to the northeast, across open desert that would be impossible to traverse on foot without being detected. Her water supplies would last perhaps 3 days in this heat, less if she had to move constantly to avoid capture. The radio intercept troubled her most. It suggested the enemy had sophisticated communications equipment and operators who understood English. This was not a random group of insurgents, it was an organized force with military-grade capabilities. Maria reached a new observation point and surveyed the area below. The search teams had found her original hiding spot and were now following her trail up the slope. They were moving slowly but steadily, and it would not be long before they reached her current position. She counted 15 fighters spread across the rocky terrain, all armed with assault rifles and moving with tactical discipline. The helicopter continued its search pattern overhead, while additional vehicles arrived to establish a perimeter around the entire area. Maria realized she was facing a coordinated military operation designed specifically to capture one person, her. The enemy was investing significant resources in this hunt, which suggested they either wanted her alive for interrogation or dead as a trophy. Neither option was acceptable. She began moving again, this time heading toward a series of deep gullies that cut through the rocky plateau. The terrain would provide excellent concealment but would also channel her movement in predictable directions. It was a calculated risk, but remaining in her current position would guarantee capture. The first gully was narrow and steep, filled with loose rocks that threatened to create noise with every step. Maria moved carefully, testing each foothold before committing her weight. Her injured knee protested every movement, but she forced herself to maintain a steady pace. Behind her, she could hear the search team spreading out as they reached the area she had just vacated. Their voices carried clearly in the desert air, and Maria could tell they were finding her tracks despite her efforts at concealment. The helicopter passed overhead again, this time much lower. The downdraft from its rotors kicked up dust and debris, but also provided Maria with cover as she moved to a new position. She used the noise to mask her movement across a section of open ground that would normally be too dangerous to cross. The second gully offered better concealment but required her to move away from the direction she ultimately needed to travel. Maria was being forced deeper into the rocky terrain, further from any possible escape route. Every step was taking her into more isolated and defensible positions, but also into areas where she could be trapped more easily. She reached a junction where 3 gullies converged and stopped to assess her situation. Behind her, the search teams were getting closer. Above her, the helicopter continued its systematic pattern. Around her, the rocky walls provided excellent protection but limited mobility. Maria checked her watch, 4 hours since the failed extraction. By now, her team would have reached their base and reported the mission results. Whether they had reported her as killed in action or missing in action would determine if anyone was coming to look for her. She tried to remember the exact sequence of events during the extraction. The blast had thrown her to the ground and created a massive dust cloud. In that confusion, with enemy fire incoming and the helicopter taking off immediately, it was possible her teammates had genuinely believed she was dead. But another part of her mind suggested a darker possibility. What if they had seen her and decided to leave anyway? What if the mission had gone wrong in some way that made her a liability rather than an asset? Maria pushed those thoughts aside. Speculation would not help her survival. She needed to focus on immediate threats and immediate solutions. The search voices were getting closer now, and she could hear equipment being moved across the rocky terrain. The enemy was bringing up heavier weapons and possibly explosives to blast through any fortified positions they discovered. She selected the narrowest gully and began moving deeper into the rock formation. The passage was barely wide enough for one person, but it offered excellent concealment and multiple defensive positions if she was forced to fight. As Maria disappeared into the narrow passage, she could hear the search teams reaching the junction behind her. Soon they would discover her tracks leading into the gully, and the hunt would continue. But, for now, she had bought herself a few more hours of freedom. The question was what to do with that time. She could not run forever, and she could not fight an entire company of enemy soldiers. She needed a plan that would either help her escape or ensure her survival until rescue arrived. If rescue was coming at all. Maria Santos pressed deeper into the rocky maze, her rifle ready and her determination unshaken. She was a Navy SEAL, and Navy SEALs never surrendered. Whatever happened next, she would face it on her own terms. The narrow passage led Maria deeper into a maze of natural tunnels carved by centuries of flash floods and wind erosion. The rocky walls rose high above her head, creating a natural fortress that would be nearly impossible for the enemy to assault directly. But it was also a trap, with limited escape routes and no way to call for help. Maria moved carefully through the winding passage, her boots finding purchase on the smooth rock floor worn down by countless seasons of water flow. The walls were so narrow in places that she had to turn sideways to pass through, her rifle and equipment scraping against the stone surfaces. Behind her, she could hear voices echoing through the canyon system as the search teams discovered her trail. Their shouts bounced off the rock walls, making it difficult to determine exactly how close they were or which direction they were approaching from. She reached a wider area where several passages intersected and stopped to catch her breath. Her injured knee was swelling badly now, and each step sent jolts of pain up her leg. Maria knew she needed to treat the injury soon, but stopping for medical attention would make her vulnerable to capture. The intersection offered multiple escape routes, which was both good and bad. Good because she could continue evading the search teams by choosing unexpected directions. Bad because the enemy could split up and cover multiple passages simultaneously, increasing their chances of finding her. Maria chose the passage that led generally northward, toward the direction where friendly forces might eventually mount a rescue operation. The tunnel was darker here, with high walls blocking most of the afternoon sunlight. She activated a small red-filtered flashlight to navigate safely through the gloom. The sound of dripping water ahead caught her attention. In this arid climate, any source of water was precious, and Maria's supplies were already running low after hours of movement and stress. She followed the sound through a series of tight turns until she found its source. A natural spring bubbled up from between the rocks, creating a small pool of clear water before disappearing back into the ground. Maria knelt beside the pool and tested the water with a purification tablet. After waiting the required time for the chemicals to work, she refilled her water bottles and allowed herself to drink deeply. The cool water felt wonderful against her parched throat, but Maria knew she could not linger. The enemy would systematically search every passage, and eventually they would find this location. She needed to keep moving while she still had the advantage of mobility. As she prepared to leave the spring, Maria heard something that made her freeze, the distinctive whining sound of a small drone flying overhead. She looked up through the narrow opening between the canyon walls and caught a glimpse of a quadcopter aircraft equipped with a camera system. The enemy was using unmanned aerial vehicles to search the canyon system from above. Any passage wide enough for the drone to navigate would be under constant surveillance. Maria realized her situation had just become much more dangerous. She moved into a section of tunnel too narrow for aerial reconnaissance and continued northward. The passage gradually began to climb, suggesting she was moving toward higher ground. That could be either beneficial or dangerous, depending on what waited at the top. The sound of voices grew louder behind her, and Maria could tell the search teams were making progress through the canyon system. They seemed to have unlimited manpower and were conducting a thorough, systematic search of every possible hiding place. She reached another junction and paused to listen carefully. The voices were coming from at least two different directions now, confirming that the enemy had split their forces to cover multiple routes. Maria was being herded toward a specific area, probably where additional forces were waiting to capture her. She chose the most difficult passage, one that required climbing over fallen rocks and squeezing through extremely narrow sections. The enemy fighters might be professionals, but most of them would be carrying heavier equipment that would slow them down in tight spaces. As Maria climbed over a particularly large boulder wedged between the canyon walls, she heard the unmistakable sound of explosions echoing through the tunnel system. The enemy was using demolition charges to widen passages or create new routes through the rock formations. The explosions sent vibrations through the stone around her, and Maria worried that the blasts might cause cave-ins or structural collapses. The ancient rock was probably stable, but repeated explosions could weaken critical support areas. She pressed forward more urgently now, knowing that the enemy's willingness to use explosives indicated they were running out of patience. They wanted her captured quickly, which suggested they had limited time before external factors forced them to abandon the operation. That thought gave Maria hope. Maybe friendly forces were already responding to her disappearance. Maybe the enemy was under pressure to complete their mission before reinforcements arrived. Either way, time might be working in her favor if she could continue evading capture. The passage began to widen as Maria climbed higher, and soon she could see daylight ahead. The tunnel was leading toward an exit, probably on the far side of the rock formation from where she had entered. If she could reach open ground, she might be able to find better defensive positions or escape routes. But, as she approached the opening, Maria heard voices from outside the tunnel. The enemy had positioned forces at the exit points as well. She was trapped between search teams moving through the tunnels behind her and blocking forces waiting outside. Maria retreated from the tunnel opening and looked for alternative routes. A narrow crack in the canyon wall caught her attention, barely wide enough for a person to pass through, but leading in a different direction from the main passage. She squeezed through the crack, her equipment scraping against the rough stone surfaces. The passage was claustrophobic and disorienting, but it led away from the areas where enemy forces were concentrated. After several minutes of difficult movement, Maria emerged into another section of the canyon system she had not seen before. This area was more complex, with multiple levels and interconnected passages that would make systematic searching much more difficult. She found a defensive position on a narrow ledge overlooking one of the main passages and settled in to observe the enemy's search patterns. Through careful watching, she might be able to identify weaknesses in their deployment or timing that could be exploited. From her elevated position, Maria could see search teams moving through the passages below. They were following standard military search procedures, but the complex terrain was forcing them to spread out more than they probably wanted to. She counted at least 8 fighters visible from her position, all carrying assault rifles and communication equipment. They moved with discipline but also with the caution of men who knew they were hunting a trained sniper in close quarters. One of the search teams passed directly below Maria's position, close enough that she could hear their conversation in Arabic. They were discussing different routes and coordinating their movements with other teams through radio communications. Maria realized she could potentially gather valuable intelligence by listening to their radio traffic. If she could understand their deployment patterns and timing, she might be able to find gaps in their coverage that would allow her to escape. But first, she needed to treat her injured knee. The swelling was getting worse, and the pain was affecting her mobility. Maria carefully opened her medical kit and applied a compression bandage to provide support and reduce inflammation. The medical treatment helped, but Maria knew the injury would continue to worsen without proper rest and care. She had perhaps one more day of effective mobility before the knee became a serious liability. As she finished treating her wound, Maria heard a new sound that made her heart sink: helicopter engines, multiple aircraft, approaching from several directions. The enemy was bringing in additional air support, probably with more sophisticated search equipment. Through a gap in the rocks, she could see 3 helicopters converging on the area. One was the same aircraft she had seen earlier, but the other 2 appeared to be newer models with advanced sensor packages and external equipment pods. The helicopters began a coordinated search pattern, flying low over the canyon system while scanning with what appeared to be thermal imaging and ground-penetrating radar. Any hiding place that had seemed secure against ground searchers might now be visible to aerial surveillance. Maria knew she needed to find shelter that would defeat thermal detection. The rocks around her were still warm from the afternoon sun, but she needed to find an area where her body heat would not stand out against the background temperature. She moved deeper into the canyon system, looking for areas where natural insulation or thermal masking might provide concealment. A section of tunnel where underground water had cooled the surrounding rocks offered the best possibility. As Maria positioned herself in the thermally neutral area, she heard radio chatter from the search teams indicating they had found something significant. She could not understand all the Arabic, but the excitement in their voices suggested they had discovered evidence of her recent presence. The search was intensifying, and Maria's options were becoming more limited with each passing hour. She needed to either find a way to escape the immediate area or prepare for a final confrontation with overwhelming enemy forces. Maria checked her weapons and ammunition. Her rifle had plenty of rounds for sustained engagement, and her sidearm was fully loaded. She also had 2 fragmentation grenades that could be effective in the close quarters of the canyon system. If escape was impossible, she could still make the enemy pay a heavy price for her capture. A trained Navy SEAL sniper in good defensive positions could inflict serious casualties on attacking forces, especially in terrain that favored the defender. But Maria Santos was not ready to make her final stand just yet. She was still alive, still mobile, and still had options. Somewhere in the maze of rock passages and hidden chambers, there had to be a way out. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the tunnel system as enemy search teams closed in on her position. Maria gripped her rifle and prepared to move once again. The hunt was far from over, and she had no intention of making it easy for them. Navy SEALs never quit, and Maria Santos would prove that principle once again. No matter what it took, no matter how long it took, she would find a way to survive and escape. The desert had not claimed her yet, and neither would the enemy forces hunting her through the canyon maze. The real test of her training and determination was still to come. Maria pressed herself against the cool rock wall as footsteps echoed through the narrow passage just meters from her position. Through a crack in the stone, she could see the muzzle of an assault rifle as an enemy fighter moved slowly past her hiding spot. The searcher paused, listening carefully for any sound that might reveal her location. For what felt like an eternity, neither of them moved. Maria controlled her breathing using the techniques that had become second nature during years of sniper training. Her heart rate slowed, her muscles relaxed, and she became virtually motionless as the enemy fighter continued his search. Finally, the footsteps moved away, and Maria allowed herself to breathe normally again. She had been hiding in the canyon system for over 6 hours now, moving constantly to stay ahead of the search teams. Her water was running low, her injured knee was getting worse, and exhaustion was beginning to cloud her judgment. But she was still alive, and that meant she still had a chance. Maria waited until the sounds of the search team had completely faded before moving to a new observation point. Through her binoculars, she could see the enemy's operation was expanding. More vehicles had arrived, along with additional personnel and equipment. They were clearly committed to capturing her, regardless of the cost. The helicopters continued their systematic search pattern, but Maria had learned to recognize their timing and routes. By staying in areas with thermal masking and moving only when the aircraft were focused elsewhere, she had managed to avoid aerial detection. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert landscape, Maria realized the approaching darkness might provide opportunities for escape. The enemy would have more difficulty coordinating their search efforts at night, and their thermal imaging would be more effective but also more limited in scope. She decided to make her move after full darkness, when the search teams would be forced to use artificial lighting that would compromise their night vision. Until then, she would remain hidden and conserve her energy for what might be her only chance at freedom. Maria settled into a well-concealed position and allowed herself to rest for the first time in hours. Her body ached from the constant movement and stress, and her injured knee throbbed with each heartbeat. She took 2 pain medication tablets from her medical kit and tried to ignore the growing hunger that was beginning to affect her concentration. As darkness fell over the canyon system, the nature of the enemy's search changed dramatically. Powerful searchlights began sweeping across the rock formations, creating moving patterns of light and shadow. The helicopters continued flying, but now they used infrared searchlights that appeared as bright white beams through Maria's night vision equipment. She watched the search patterns carefully, timing the movements of both ground teams and aircraft. There was a gap in their coverage along the eastern edge of the canyon system, where the terrain became too difficult for vehicles and the helicopter pilots seemed reluctant to fly too close to the rock walls. That gap represented her best chance for escape. Maria began moving toward the eastern edge, using the shadows between searchlight sweeps to mask her movement. The terrain was treacherous in the darkness, with loose rocks and hidden obstacles that could easily cause a fall or injury. Her injured knee made every step painful, but Maria pushed through the discomfort with the determination that had carried her through SEAL training. Pain was temporary, but capture would be permanent. She had to keep moving no matter what it cost her physically. The sound of voices ahead made her freeze in place. An enemy patrol was moving through the exact area she needed to cross. Maria counted at least 4 fighters, all carrying rifles with mounted flashlights that swept back and forth across the rocky terrain. She found concealment behind a large boulder and waited for the patrol to pass. Through the gap at the base of the rock, she could see their boots as they walked by less than 2 meters from her position. One of the fighters stopped directly in front of her hiding spot and spoke into his radio in Arabic. Maria understood enough to know he was reporting their progress to a command post. The search was being coordinated from a central location, probably with real-time updates on all team positions and any discoveries. That level of organization suggested professional military leadership, not amateur militia fighters. After the patrol moved on, Maria continued toward the eastern edge of the canyon system. The terrain became increasingly difficult as she climbed toward higher ground, but it also provided better concealment from the searchlights below. She reached a ridge that offered an overview of the entire area and was shocked by what she saw. The enemy operation was massive, dozens of vehicles, hundreds of personnel, and multiple aircraft all focused on finding one person. The resources being devoted to her capture suggested this was much more than a random encounter with hostile forces. Someone very important wanted Maria Santos captured alive, and they were willing to commit significant military assets to make it happen. That realization changed Maria's understanding of her situation completely. This was not just about escaping enemy territory, it was about avoiding capture by people who had specifically targeted her for reasons she did not understand. The failed extraction, the immediate enemy response, and the massive search operation all suggested a level of planning and preparation that went far beyond coincidence. Maria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling desert air.
Had her mission been compromised from the beginning? Had someone provided intelligence about their operation to the enemy? Were her own teammates involved in setting up her abandonment?
She pushed those questions aside and focused on immediate survival.
Understanding the conspiracy could wait until she was safely back in friendly territory.
Right now, she needed to concentrate on getting out of the canyon system without being detected. The eastern edge offered a steep but manageable route down to open desert. Once she reached level ground, Maria would have several kilometers of exposed terrain to cross before reaching any cover. It would be dangerous, but it was her best option for avoiding the concentrated search efforts in the canyon. She began the descent carefully, testing each foothold before committing her weight. The slope was loose and unstable, threatening to send rocks sliding down that would create noise and potentially injure her further. Halfway down the slope, Maria heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching rapidly. One of the search aircraft was heading directly toward her position, probably responding to thermal signatures detected by its sensors. Maria pressed herself against the rock face and remained motionless as the helicopter passed overhead. The downdraft from its rotors sent loose debris flying through the air, but the aircraft continued on without detecting her presence. She waited until the helicopter had moved away before continuing her descent. The bottom of the slope was still 50 meters away, and every meter brought increased risk of detection by ground patrols or aerial surveillance. As Maria reached the base of the ridge, she heard something that made her heart race, the sound of approaching vehicles from multiple directions. The enemy had detected her movement somehow and was moving to intercept her before she could reach open ground. Headlights appeared through the darkness as trucks and armored vehicles converged on her position.
Maria realized she had perhaps 2 minutes before the area would be completely surrounded.
She needed to move now or find a defensive position to make her stand. The open desert offered no concealment, but a dry riverbed cut across the landscape just ahead of her position. It would provide some protection from direct fire and might offer escape routes if she could reach it in time. Maria ran across the open ground as fast as her injured knee would allow, expecting at any moment to hear the crack of rifle fire or the impact of bullets around her. Behind her, the vehicles were getting closer, their engines roaring as drivers pushed them to maximum speed across the rough terrain. She reached the riverbed just as the first searchlight swept across the area where she had been running. The dry channel was deeper than it had appeared from a distance, offering excellent concealment and multiple directions for movement. Maria moved downstream, using the riverbed as a natural trench that would hide her from both ground and aerial observation. The bottom was sandy and relatively quiet, allowing her to move quickly without creating much noise. Behind her, she could hear vehicles arriving at the base of the ridge and search teams beginning to spread out across the area. Shouts in Arabic indicated they had found her tracks leading toward the riverbed, and it would not be long before they discovered her route. The riverbed curved toward the north, in the direction where friendly forces might eventually mount a rescue operation. Maria followed the curve, putting distance between herself and the immediate search area while moving toward potential help. After 30 minutes of movement through the riverbed, Maria allowed herself to hope that she might actually escape the immediate threat. The sounds of the search operation were fading behind her, and no aircraft were currently visible in her area. That hope was shattered when she heard the unmistakable sound of multiple helicopters approaching from ahead. The enemy had anticipated her movement through the riverbed and positioned aircraft to intercept her before she could reach open ground. Maria realized she was trapped in the channel with enemy forces approaching from both directions. The sides of the riverbed were too steep to climb quickly, and there was nowhere to hide from aerial observation. She found a section where erosion had created a small cave in the riverbed wall and squeezed inside just as the first helicopter passed overhead. The cave was barely large enough for one person, but it offered complete concealment from aerial detection. Through the cave opening, Maria could see searchlights sweeping back and forth across the riverbed as helicopters flew low overhead. Ground teams were entering the channel from both directions, moving systematically toward her position. Maria checked her weapons one final time. Her rifle had a full magazine, her sidearm was ready, and she had 2 grenades that could be devastating in the confined space of the riverbed. If this was where she would make her last stand, she would ensure the enemy paid a heavy price. But, as she prepared for what might be her final battle, Maria heard something unexpected, the distant sound of different helicopters, approaching from the northwest. The engine noise was different from the enemy aircraft, deeper and more powerful. American helicopters.
Through her night vision equipment, Maria could see navigation lights approaching rapidly from the direction of friendly territory. 2 aircraft, probably Black Hawks, flying low and fast toward her location. The rescue mission she had hoped for was finally arriving, but would it be too late? Enemy ground forces were less than 100 meters away now, moving through the riverbed with flashlights and thermal imaging equipment. The timing would be critical. If her rescuers arrived too late, they would find only an empty cave and evidence of a final battle. Maria activated her emergency beacon, the one piece of equipment she had saved for this exact moment. The signal would guide friendly aircraft to her exact position, but it would also alert every enemy fighter in the area to her location. The sound of American helicopters grew closer, and Maria could hear the enemy forces responding with urgent radio calls in Arabic. They knew rescue was imminent and were desperately trying to reach her before the cavalry arrived. Maria Santos pressed deeper into the small cave and prepared for the most important few minutes of her life. Everything she had endured, the abandonment, the hunt, the pain and exhaustion, had led to this moment. She was still alive, still fighting, and help was finally on the way. The question was whether she could survive just a few more minutes until her fellow warriors arrived to bring her home. The sound of gunfire erupted from both directions as American and enemy forces engaged each other in the darkness above her hiding place. Maria smiled grimly and gripped her rifle tighter. Navy SEALs never quit, and Maria Santos was about to prove that principle one more time. //